Last year, the Florida Panthers made the Stanley Cup Finals. You'd be forgiven for forgetting it wasn't their first rodeo. After all, the Panthers had been largely terrible in the 30 years of their existence, failing to qualify for the postseason 20 out of 29 times, and that too may be easy to forget. After all, recency bias-wise, the Panthers have made almost half of their all-time playoff appearances in the last 5 years. Still, making the finals in only their third season was some feat, especially when considering that most of the expansion franchises introduced in the 90s were utter dross. This wasn't the soft launch enjoyed by the Golden Knights or the Kraken. The expansion rules were almost punitive back then. Just look at the first 2 seasons the San Jose Sharks endured and the first 4 for the Ottawa Senators. Indeed, while the Sharks floundered, do Sharks flounder? The Panthers hit the ground well, not running, but sort of stumbling purposefully. 83 points in their first season meant the Panthers missed out on a playoff berth by just a single point, and while their sophomore season was expansion franchise bad, they went on to make the Stanley Cup final in their third attempt. There were no great differences in the 1991 or 1992 expansion draft compared to the 93 draft, other than the Sharks were also embroiled in a dispersal draft. Tampa, who were also bought in with the 92 draft, were a big bag of meh in their first few seasons, more mediocre than notably bad, as were the Mighty Ducks, who drafted with Florida, although their second year was eye-wateringly poor. As such, having ascended almost immediately to a Stanley Cup final, the Panthers became, in many ways, the poster child for sunbelt expansion, and in the intervening years of struggle that followed, something of a dog whistle for those who saw expansion into the sunbelt as a failure or anti-hockey. There's a certain subset of hockey fans who believe every small snow-blown town in Canada should have a team before Sunrise, Florida. Now, most people associate the Sunbelt expansion with full-time pantomime villain and sometime league commissioner Gary Bettman.
Good afternoon. I love your energy.
And some of the biggest misses were certainly on his watch. I'm looking at you, Atlanta and Phoenix. But Florida were actually introduced just prior to Bettman's hiring, and having the intervening years stood out amongst the Southern expansion teams, in part because they were the southernmost, they leaned into their sort of tropical unhockey image, and they characterized, alongside Atlanta and Phoenix, years of Sunbelt futility and struggles to fill their arena. Infamously, they played the Ottawa Senators in front of a crowd of 7,300 in October 2014, which led to some speculation regarding relocation. Now a decade later, as the Panthers chase a President's Trophy and Sam Reinhart becomes a 50-goal scorer, the ghosts of Olli Jokinen are quietly being laid to rest. Which is funny because their neighbours, the Tampa Bay Lightning, have never had to deal with an existential threat. Still, even as we see floods of young prospects reach the NHL having grown up in non-traditional hockey markets, there are those that still decry the existence of the Sunbelt teams and still see a team based in southern Florida as antithetical to hockey, especially when Quebec City remains Nordiqueless. So what if I told you the Florida Panthers were not the first team to play out of the Miami metropolitan area? What if I told you that in fact a whole hockey league was based in Miami at one time? Would you guess when that was? Maybe the 80s, the idea of a neon Vice City hockey league playing to a soundtrack of anachronistic synthwave sounds pretty cool. But you'd be wrong. In fact, you'd be out by over a half century. Indeed, there was a bit of a war brewing over in Europe when an idea was hatched to spread the gospel of hockey into the southernmost of southern states. The NHL was only just old enough to start drinking when the owners of the Metropolitan Ice Palace hatched a plan to ensnare Eastern Canadian snowbirds to their arena. A hockey league would be born, the Tropical Hockey League. The year is 1938. The town of Coral Gables, a planned community, is in its 13th year of incorporation. Planned, built and founded by one George E. Merrick, a real estate developer, Coral Gables was the product of an idealist. Merrick, an advocate of the City Beautiful movement and a strict aestheticist, designed Coral Gables down to its very minutiae, carving a city of wide tree-lined boulevards and Mediterranean revivalist architecture from 3,000 acres of citrus groves and pine trees left to him by his father. Part of Merrick's grand new town was the building of a coliseum that would serve as a cultural hub for the city of Miami. Designed by architect Albert Ten Eck Brown, shovels broke ground in 1927. Running to a cost of $900,000 at the time, the equivalent of around $16 million today, construction began at a considerably, shall we say, inopportune time. By the early 1920s, automobile ownership was growing, and with the paving of the Dixie Highway coupled with the extension of the Florida East Coast Railway, more and more visitors were finding their way to Miami. In 1920, there were just 644 year-round residents of Miami Beach, but by 1925 that number had risen almost fivefold. Meanwhile, the draining of the Everglades was creating huge tracts of new dry land primed for development. Real estate developers such as John Collins and Carl Fisher attempted to stoke interest in Floridian real estate through advertisements in northern newspapers. In the case of Fisher, he even rented a billboard in Times Square in midwinter with the tagline, "It's June in Miami." Florida was becoming both a hot and obtainable location. It was the roaring 20s, the American peacetime economy was booming. Years of war and the recession of 1921 were gone, and the American people were, per capita, the richest in the world. Tin can tourists began flocking to Florida in their Model Ts from the northern states, many looking to buy up plots of land. Floridian soil became like Klondike gold. With prices booming, northern realtors flooded the market. Among them was Pennsylvanian George E. Merrick and numerous other investors who saw the opportunity to capitalize on the boom, not by simply flipping plots of land, but by building whole communities. Indeed, Coral Gables was but one of numerous planned communities that sprung up from the dirt during the Floridian land boom. Hialeah, Miami Springs, and Opa-locka, even Hollywood, no, not that one, would all come into existence within the blink of prosperity. But with all booms, there is an inevitable bust. In January 1925, Forbes magazine warned that the price of land in Florida was based solely on the expectation of finding a customer, not upon any reality of land value. Like any bubbles before or since, be it tulips, beanie babies, or NFTs and crypto, the price was predicated on speculation and became a bigger fool scam. New York investors were already beginning to lose money as customers dried up, and in the state itself, construction workers were finding themselves laid off even as the number of realtors increased. To curtail unscrupulous realtors flipping land at exorbitant costs, the state government began introducing increased regulations, including stricter licensing and the requirement for all salesmen to have fixed offices. By now, Jacksonville, the gateway to the state, was outgrowing its facilities, but had begun withholding the financing for people heading further south. Many early to the boom began trying to sell on their land at a loss. Suddenly there was a surplus of land and a shortage of buyers. To compound matters, the vast influx of building materials had begun to cause issues with the railways. Rail freight rates began to skyrocket in an effort to reduce the strain on the system, eventually leading to the big three Floridian rail companies, the Seaboard Air Line Railway, the Florida East Coast Railway, and the Atlantic Coast Railway, calling an embargo on all but foodstuffs, fuel, perishables, and essential commodities. And this would have been fine if not just months later access to Miami Harbor hadn't been blocked by the schooner Prince Valdemar running aground. The enforced lull in development activity allowed investors to take a step back and appraise the situation in Florida, and it became clear that the facade of the Miami paradise was crumbling. As with all booms, it had been all too much too fast. The growth was unsustainable, and the days of Miami properties being flipped multiple times a day were over. Still, the likes of Merrick, Collins, and Fisher ploughed on. Those who had their money tied up in vast projects had little choice. The potential scale of loss was an economy of scale. Coral Gables was essentially finished, as was the University of Miami, a project Merrick had invested nearly $5 million, the equivalent to $87 million today. The Coliseum was but one of a number of social projects Merrick wanted to see through. When the Category 4 Great Hurricane of Miami made landfall near the city itself on the 18th of December 1926, the final nail was driven into the boom. 372 people would lose their lives in the catastrophe, and the damage and cost of economic losses, if adjusted for today's societal conditions, would exceed that of Hurricane Katrina. Many of those who'd made Miami their home in the intervening years fled the state, clearing out their bank accounts and forcing many banks to the brink of bankruptcy. Many half-finished mega projects were abandoned and left incomplete. Countless damaged buildings were left in a state of disarray, their owners unable or unwilling to afford repair, joining the many developments in construction at the time of the disaster, all to eventually be bulldozed and swept away. If people were reticent after the Forbes article, the pall of tragedy now fell over Miami. The Florida land boom had ended, and the state entered the Great Depression years before the rest of the country. In 1927, still trying to develop Coral Gables further, Merrick fell into considerable debt. Many of his projects to expand Coral Gables were abandoned or sold off. The Coliseum construction, at first opulent, had to be steadily pared back until eventually the money ran out altogether. Merrick was forced to sell the building to the city of Coral Gables, who completed the building on a budget. The city attempted to run the Coliseum as Merrick intended, as a concert hall and convention centre, but the Coliseum's early years were forged at a time when the state's fortunes were a stark contrast to those when the building was conceived. Miami's population boom had slowed significantly after the 1926 hurricane, and tourism had been undermined by the Great Depression. The city of Coral Gables had some success marketing the Coliseum as an exhibition centre and hosted occasional conferences. Concerts provided sporadic income, but by and large, the Coliseum was something of a white elephant. As the 30s wore on, the US slowly began to emerge from the Great Depression. With the clouds slowly lifting on Florida, the city of Coral Gables was still at a loss as to what to do with the Coliseum. One figure that had become significant in the cultural zeitgeist, a superstar of pre-war America, was the Norwegian figure skater Sonja Henie. A three-time Olympic champion, Henie had transitioned from Olympic amateur to a professional traveling performer in the mid-30s. However, Henie had already become a star in her teens and is often cited as the first teen idol. With her sell-out travelling ice extravaganza crisscrossing America, often to raucous crowds, there was suddenly a demand for ice venues where previously ice had been absent. Indeed, it was a performance at the Polar Palace ice rink in Hollywood, yes, that one, that would catapult Henie to megastardom, having signed on with 20th Century Fox. Her first feature film, One in a Million, was one of the highest grossing films of 1937, despite Henie's inability to, act. Yet regardless of Henie's theatrical attributes, she was the greatest figure skater of her day and would go on to star in a number of other, mostly ice skating themed films. However, while her films were lucrative, her travelling ice shows were tremendous money spinners, both for Henie and the venues. And much as 1948's Red Shoes starring Moira Shearer influenced a generation of ballerinas, Henie's shows and movies motivated a generation of girls to take up skating. And even in Florida, the demand for ice was now outstripping supply. And so the kernel of an idea formed within the city of Coral Gables to convert the Miami Coliseum into an ice palace, the Metropolitan Ice Palace to be exact, a conversion that would come at no small cost. The ice plant alone would have set the city back approximately $50,000 to purchase and install, the equivalent to just over $1 million today. Still, the city wagered that public skating would provide a relatively stable source of income for the building, while sporadic ice shows would benefit from the capacity of 3,750. However, there was a significant number of snowbirds making Miami their winter homes, travelling from the hockey hotbeds of America and eastern Canada. The city saw another potential source of relatively stable income: the formation of a hockey league. Every hockey fan is familiar with the paradigm of the Original Six. By 1938, the Original Six had coalesced, and the New York Americans still had a few years left of existence. But what might be hard for modern hockey fans to comprehend was how few roster spots there were for hockey players. Obviously, less teams means less jobs, but it was also an era when teams iced fewer players throughout the season. In 1938-39, NHL rosters were limited to 15 skaters, and the Stanley Cup champion Boston Bruins only used 20 skaters all season. They also iced 2 goalies. By comparison, last year's Stanley Cup winning Las Vegas Golden Knights iced 30 skaters and 5 goaltenders on the way to a cup, and that was in a 32-team league. The concept of a farm system was relatively new in 1938-39, with the forerunner to the American Hockey League, the International American Hockey League, founded just 2 years before. Competition to make it into the NHL was stiff. Roster spots were usually a case of dead man's shoes, and for many players, the allure of a career in the minors was lucrative jobs that came in tandem with a contract with the club. This often provided better income than the hockey itself. A good example would be the players who iced for the Trail Smoke Eaters. They would arrive in Trail expecting to find well-paid work with the Consolidated Smelting and Mining Company of Canada or one of the town's lumberyards whilst playing hockey on the side. Remember, this was a long time before players could travel to Europe to prolong their career, so you'd think the allure of playing hockey in the tropics would attract some big names from the vast pool of minor league hockey. Well, it's important to remember that in the days prior to widespread television coverage and internet, minor leaguers were still stars in their own towns. Small communities lived and died by the fortunes of their hometown teams, regardless of level, and because so many minor leaguers had careers on the side, the gravitational pull of the Tropical Hockey League was lessened. And worse was to come for the upstart league. Unable to secure affiliation with the American Hockey Association of the United States, the newly minted governing body for hockey in the US, efforts to recruit top-level talent was further hampered. Indeed, W.G. Hardy, the incumbent at the time president of the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association, warned players not to sign with the Tropical Hockey League, going as far as to threaten players with suspension. Hardy stated that for the Tropical Hockey League to be recognised by the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association, the Tropical Hockey League must first be members of the Amateur Hockey Association of the United States, and that the league must prove by posting a bond for return transportation for such players as they want that they have enough financial backing to ensure that the hockey players will not be left stranded in Miami. Hardy added as a dire warning, unless these conditions are fulfilled, players going to Miami will be suspended. This will mean suspension in all organised professional and amateur hockey. It's evident that Hardy was concerned about the long-term viability of the league and the somewhat laissez-faire attitude the Miami promoters were taking to the whole endeavour in failing to secure or even pursue affiliation with the national governing body. At this time, the American Hockey Association, the Eastern Hockey League, and the American teams of the Pacific Coast Hockey League and the Michigan-Ontario Hockey League had all secured affiliation with the Amateur Hockey Association of the United States. Regardless, promoters for the Tropical Hockey League travelled north of the border in October 1938 to begin their recruitment drive. 4 teams were to be created: the Miami Clippers, the Miami Beach Pirates, and, slightly bizarrely, the Havana Tropicals, so named in an effort to lure curious fans from the little Havana neighbourhood that was burgeoning at the time, were formed from a base in Port Colborne, Ontario. The final team, the ersatz home team if you will, the Coral Gables Seminoles, set up their base of operations in Winnipeg, attracting mostly Manitobans, which created a healthy East-West Canada rivalry between the Coral Gables Seminoles and the rest of the league. Lee McCaskey, Pop Johnson, Mel Barr, Bunny Deschamps
All the stars.
had failed to be recruited by the Tropical Hockey League,
I feel like Todd will be struggling to know these people.
and it was small wonder after Hardy's threat. The ragtag collection of minor league veterans, rank amateurs, or former junior players remained in Port Colborne and Winnipeg with the promoters throughout the month of November for something of a month-long training camp. The training camps were overseen by the 4 newly hired head coaches, and while the players faced the possibility of sanctions if they signed on with the league, the Tropical Hockey League had succeeded in luring a smattering of star power behind the benches. In Winnipeg, the promoters had secured the services of Magnus Mike Goodman. Son of Icelandic emigrants, Goodman had been a member of the 1920 Winnipeg Falcons, who'd won the Allen Cup defeating the Toronto Varsity Blues, thus becoming the leading amateur senior hockey team in Canada. Their reward was to represent Canada at the 1920 Summer Olympics in Antwerp, and yes, I haven't misread that. Ice hockey was part of the 1920 Summer Olympics program, the first time ice hockey was an Olympic sport, and the event also doubled as not only the first Olympic event, but the inaugural World Championships for hockey. Goodman was a forward, and albeit the lowest scoring forward on the Falcons' Canadian side, he still played an instrumental part in Canada winning gold, scoring once in a 12-1 two-period victory against Sweden. Actually, as a sidebar, the Winnipeg Falcons are a fascinating story unto themselves. The falcon is the national bird of Iceland, and the Winnipeg Falcons were a team made up of Icelandic immigrants and second-generation Icelandic Canadians who were barred from playing on other teams due to their ethnic origin. It's ironic to think that this team of players excluded because of their ethnicity originated from a country that has almost no hockey footprint otherwise, would go on to win gold for a country that hadn't wanted them. Other than Goodman, whose name was an anglicised version of Gudmundsson, players included Benson, born of Benedict Johansson, Fredriksson, Fridfinsson, Halder Haldarsson, and Conrad Johannesson. Anyway, back to the Coral Gables Seminoles. Mike Goodman was now 40, some 18 years had passed since he'd led Canada to Olympic gold, but aside from coaching, he was planning on lacing them up and leading the line for his new team. And why not? Goodman had spent the last 11 years playing for a variety of teams in the American Hockey Association and winning the AHA championship in Duluth and in Kansas City. He'd also accrued managerial experience in Wichita and Kansas City. In his youth, Goodman was known for his speed, and it was said of him that he could skate faster backwards than most could forwards. Goodman had been a speed skating champion. While he may have lost his edge in speed, he was still a slick skater when compared to the scrubs the league had managed to scramble together. The Miami Beach Pirates hired Stan Jackson as their coach. Jackson had over 85 games of NHL experience as a player, lacing up for the Toronto St. Pats, the Boston Bruins, and 8 games for the original Ottawa Senators. His last game in the NHL came in 1927, but he battled on for 6 more years in the American minors before returning to Canada to manage the Charlottetown Abbeys of the Big Four League. Arguably, the greatest coup was the Miami Clippers, who'd managed to hire Bullet Joe Simpson for their bench. Simpson was coming off the back of 2 seasons coaching the Minneapolis Millers of the American Hockey Association, where he had befriended Mike Goodman. The Millers had lost in the 37-38 finals, but had won the Harry F. Sinclair Trophy the year before under Simpson. Simpson was also the only coach with NHL coaching experience, having managed the New York Americans between 1932-33 through to 34-35. These had been lean years for the Americans, who could only best the cash-starved Ottawa Senators in the Canadian division, and in his 3 years at the helm, the Americans never made the playoffs. Nicknamed Bullet because, like his friend Goodman, Simpson was a lightning-fast skater, Bullet Joe had spent 6 years patrolling the blue line for the New York Americans between 1925 and 1931. However, prior to his NHL days, Simpson had fought and been injured at the Battle of the Somme, having had a long military hockey career, even winning the 1916 Allen Cup with the Winnipeg 61st Battalion. Injured again prior to the armistice, Simpson would return to his hometown of Selkirk, Manitoba, where he would play with his hometown fishermen alongside Goodman, and it was here that he was spotted by Kenny McKenzie, head coach of the Edmonton Eskimos. Simpson's Eskimos would win the 1922-23 Western Canada Hockey League Championship and play in the Stanley Cup Finals against the Ottawa Senators of the NHL. The Senators would win, but Bullet Joe would be the only man to have any hand in the Tropical Hockey League, who would later be enshrined in the Hockey Hall of Fame. The final coaching hire came in the form of Jerry Page, who had considerably less cachet than his 3 other peers. Plucked from obscurity to lead the Havana Tropicals, Page had been the director of hockey for the Chicago chapter of the Catholic Youth Organization prior to being hired for a head coaching role in a professional hockey league. Page was a defenseman and, like Goodman, would also be doing double duty as coach and player. Finally, after months of preparation, the newly hired players and coaches decamped from Canada and made their way down to Miami in December 1938. In 2 months, 4 coaches and 50 or so players had been scraped together from the east and west of Canada, and having left the frigid winter of the Great White North, found themselves in the tropics of Florida on December 6th. 3 days later, on December 9th, the players made their first and only practice in their new home rink prior to the start of the season. Nevertheless, this was a landmark moment. As Goodman, Jackson, Simpson and Page watched their players going through their drills, this practice session likely marked the first organised ice hockey activity in Floridian history. The next day would be puck drop. The inaugural season of the Tropical Hockey League began on the 10th of December 1938. The Miami Beach Pirates versus the Miami Clippers was to be the opening game. A 9 p.m. face-off demonstrated that folk were hardier back then, but was also in part because the city was working in partnership with the Lincoln Theatre and often advertised hockey and cinema as a double feature night out. Indeed, 2 weeks after opening night, the film The Duke of West Point was released, which featured a plot loosely surrounding a hockey game. Prior to face-off, both teams somewhat bizarrely took to the ice for a narrated demonstration of the sport, presumably at reduced speed to the benefit of those who'd never seen a game of hockey before. Then, for a bit of added glamour, Patrice and Marty Del Grande dropped the puck to begin the season. Del Grande was a Mexican dancer more famous for being married to the writer Damon Runyon, famed for his short stories, 2 of which had been adapted into Guys and Dolls. Aside from this B-list adjacent celebrity dropping the puck, the near-capacity crowd were entertained between periods by Kit Klein, Ellen Teal, Vic Ronchetti and Leo Freisinger, who were all speed skating champions of one flavour or another. They were joined by Luc Trombator and Pop Boudreau, former hockey players who'd marketed themselves as comedy and novelty skating acts, kind of the Mansoor Barami of skating. It's hard to know what they had them all doing in the first intermission, however the second intermission was perhaps more appropriately a Mambo concert. And much as you can tell by my script, the hockey was almost an afterthought, part of a larger ice review. The opening game would eventually be won by Simpson's Clippers, Jim Ellis scoring a late goal to clinch the game 3-2 before the game devolved into a massive brawl. Klein, Runchetti and Freisinger would become a fixture of the intermission entertainment at the Ice Palace throughout December. Other attractions would include figure skating, barrel jumping and broomball, the latter being an ice sport that didn't require skates, which the Ice Palace was aggressively trying to promote as a fun activity for the hockey game patrons. Free public skating was also offered after games, presumably on the old ice, in an effort by the venue to increase interest in public skating, still the venue's primary revenue earner. In January, a game between the Coral Gables Seminoles and the Miami Beach Pirates would be refereed by King Clancy, the legendary Ottawa Senators and Toronto Maple Leafs player. Clancy had been fired as head coach of the Montreal Maroons in December 1938 and had decided to remain in hockey as an official. The Seminoles-Pirates game would mark the start of Clancy's 11-year stint as a hockey referee, most of which was in the somewhat more illustrious NHL. However, there were few high points in the season. Goodman's Seminoles walked the league as interest waned. The Seminoles pulled out an unassailable lead with a quarter of the season remaining. Throughout, the hockey on show was agricultural at best, at odds to the glitz and glamour that promoters were trying to glom onto the sides of otherwise, at best, workman-like minor leaguers and amateurs. Fights were commonplace, as were scrums, and players routinely chopped each other with their sticks. Just as the season began to taper out, a February game between the Seminoles and Pirates was almost abandoned when all the players, as well as the coaching staff and, purportedly, some fans, made their way onto the ice for a proper Donnybrook. With crowds shrinking, the entertainment on offer between periods became sparser. The season was supposed to run through to April, but with the Seminoles running away with the league, the season ended 2 games shy of its complete schedule. Ironically, the Havana Tropicals were the only team to complete their schedule, and they finished bottom with only 4 wins in their 15-game season. There was no playoff, after all there were only 4 teams. Instead, the curtain fell on a final game between the champions, the Coral Gables Seminoles, and an all-star team comprised of the best players for the Pirates, the Clippers, and the Tropicals. There was also a barrel jumping competition between periods that Mike Goodman participated in. A crowd of 3,200 was on hand to watch the Seminoles lose out 6-5 to the All-Stars that evening, before making their way to the arena lobby for an old-fashioned barn dance, to see the league off into the night. Whilst the closing night's attendance had been healthy, the league had struggled to maintain momentum. The late start times were cited as one issue, as was the weak competition and the constant fighting. With promoters losing money on the venture, the Tropical Hockey League was shuttered after just 1 season. Before the final game came a eulogy from the sports desk of Jack Bell. There's a hockey game tonight at the old Coral Gables Coliseum, now dubbed the Ice Palace, the final game of the year. Coral Gables, it seems to me, has missed a bet on this ice hockey. The city out southwest of Miami had a most attractive and exciting sport tossed into its lap last fall, and hasn't done much about it. Ice hockey in the tropics? Now there was an idea with which to play at will. Winter sport in the tropics. It didn't click exactly. Leo Lee McCaskey of the Seminoles would be the scoring leader for the league's solitary season. McCaskey scored 16 goals and 13 assists in 14 appearances. To underscore the mediocrity of the competition at hand, McCaskey had hung his skates up 4 years prior to the formation of the Tropical Hockey League, and even in his prime had only scored 20 points in 30 games in the Central Hockey League. McCaskey would join the Canadian Navy as a leading writer following his time in the Tropical Hockey League, and would be killed in service in 1945 at just 32 years old. The Pirates' Charles Knuckler Irvin would be named the most popular player. Having played only 11 games, Irvin managed to amass 17 points. Irvin had spent the season bouncing around America, appearing 9 times for the New Haven Eagles in the NHL-affiliated International American Hockey League, and 14 times for the Kansas City Greyhounds before landing in Florida. Irvin would pause his hockey career to serve during World War II and would later attempt to resurrect his career in the newly renamed American Hockey League, but to little avail, eventually returning home to New Brunswick. For most, the Tropical Hockey League would be the denouement of their careers due to a lack of talent or the looming threat of war. John J. Mikulich, who played left wing for the risible Havana Tropicals, would go on to play 2 seasons with the Kansas City Americans of the American Hockey Association, twice finishing as runners-up. Mikulich, sons of Yugoslavian immigrants, would then sign up to the US Air Force as an assistant engineer, and was tragically killed in action during bomber training in January 1943. He was just 26. The war, however, would provide one alumni of the Tropical Hockey League an opportunity at the game's highest level. Minnesotan Bob Dill was just 18 when he reported to training camp for the Miami Clippers. Dill had left high school early to pursue a career in professional hockey to help his mother pay the bills after the death of his father. Players of the Tropical Hockey League were paid $25 a week, roughly $550 a week in today's money, and for an 18-year-old this was a remarkable sum. Dill, however, was an unremarkable player. He posted 8 points in 12 games and 8 penalty minutes with Havana and fell into amateur hockey in Sault Ste. Marie the season after. However, in 1940-41, he landed a gig with the Baltimore Orioles in the Eastern Hockey League where his game had developed significantly. A little older, Dill had become a lot rougher. His bruising play caught the eye of legendary former NHLer Eddie Shaw, who was coaching the Springfield Indians in the American Hockey League. Shaw was still patrolling the blue line with the Indians, and Dill and Shaw became D-line partners. After briefly joining the Buffalo Bisons in the AHL, Dill was called up to the US Coast Guard. Dill would return to the Eastern Hockey League with the infamous US Coast Guard Cutters, playing out of Baltimore. Dubbed the Hooligans Navy by Dick Young, the leading baseball journalist of the New York Daily News. Dill's military service was spent battering AHL forwards on a blue line that also featured John Mariucci, Manny Kotler, and Art Coulter. Released from the Coast Guard a year later, Dill would rejoin the AHL's Buffalo Bisons, who were at the time affiliated with the Montreal Canadiens. Suspended in the AHL after an incident with a referee, Dill was picked up by the Rangers in a trade with Montreal that saw 3 players going back to Montreal for the Fighting Irishmen. Frank Boucher's Rangers had been decimated due to military service in the early 40s and were a truly horrible side in 43-44. Dill had stepped into a Rangers side who'd amassed just 4 wins in 22 games, and they would go on to win just 2 more during the remainder of that season with Dill on the blue line. Playing just half a season, Dill would lead the Rangers in penalty minutes in 43-44, and 16 points in just 28 games would also mean he had one of the strongest offensive outputs from the defence. Known as aggressive but clean, Dill liked to throw his weight around and throw his fists too. Dill became a lightning rod for fans watching a bad team, and he stuck on the roster for 44-45. Nicknamed the baddest man in hockey, Dill was often deployed to neutralise other teams' stars, and no star came bigger than the Rocket Richard. Indeed, Richard was the dominant player of the day. He was also no shrinking violet. Dill's reputation took a severe blow, both figuratively and literally, midway through the 44-45 season when Richard took it upon himself to lay Dill out during a game with a surprise punch to the face, knocking Dill to the ice. Most likely concussed and certainly groggy, Dill continued to berate Richard in the penalty box, where Richard would react and punch Dill again. The scene became infamous in the 2005 movie The Rocket, where at the time NHL enforcer Sean Avery depicted Dill, albeit quite some artistic license was invoked. Still, Dill Pickled became the headline in francophone newspapers the next day, and Dill's NHL tenure began to taper out. The Rangers were poor again, winning just 11 of 50 games. Dill played in 48 games, but his offensive output from the year prior was heavily diminished. With players returning from the war, roster spots were few and far between. Dill would end up becoming a slugger in the short-lived USHL before coaching alongside Eddie Shaw for a time back in Springfield. Still, Dill was the only player who would rise from the Tropical Hockey League to reach the NHL. However, even as the players disbanded, the Tropical Hockey League wasn't quite dead. After a successful sellout benefit game for a crippled children's hospital between the Seminoles and the Pirates in July 1940, Mike Goodman and Bullet Joe Simpson, who had settled in Miami following the conclusion of the 38-39 season, managed to secure funding to resurrect the league on a purely amateur basis from Burdeens, Pan Am and Florida Power and Light. Unlike before, the players would be sought from the Miami area and comprised mostly college students and military servicemen stationed in the area. The league was played as a summer through to January hockey league with 3 teams. The Seminoles, now rebranded the Indians as practically every league needed a team called the Indians at the time, returned, as did the Clippers and the Pirates. Apparently interest in the Cuban community didn't warrant a resurrection of the Tropicals. Goodman and Simpson returned to coach, and Coral Gables would once again win the league, beating the Pirates 8-6 in the final. This iteration of the Summer League managed to limp into a second season where a former NHLer in the form of Bill Regan, albeit almost a decade removed from the big league, turned out for the Clippers. He was joined by hockey royalty adjacent in the form of Bill Holmes, son of legendary early hockey goaltender Harry Hap Holmes, who'd relocated to Florida in the late 30s to open a papaya farm. The Coral Gables side was once again romp into the league in 1941 when the league was abandoned in July. And in September 1941, the city of Coral Gables filed a $42,000 lawsuit against the Ice Palace's operators seeking the foreclosure of the mortgage. Shortly after, the newly renamed Miami Coliseum would be leased out as a center to train military pilots. Goodman and Simpson remained bullish about hockey in Miami, however, and again sought funding, this time to construct a new ice venue in Miami. This never seemed to happen, and while the Coliseum would be turned back into an ice rink in 1949, momentum for the sport had largely died out. Indeed, not just in Miami, but in Hollywood. After 5 movies centered around hockey were produced between 1936 to 1940, only 2 hockey films would be made in the next 30 years. The Hollywood fascination with ice sports was over, and hockey receded into the sporting zeitgeist back into its traditional hotbeds. As for Goodman and Simpson, they may never have achieved popularizing the sport in the southern states of America. Indeed, Southerners would have to wait for the establishment of the Charlotte Checkers in 1956 for another stab at hockey in the Deep South. But the two would remain lifelong friends, having both settled in Miami. Simpson would survive a massive heart attack in the early 40s, and during his recovery would be offered a job by Art Coulter, the same Art Coulter who'd played alongside Bob Dill on the Coast Guard cutters, selling skates in a hardware store in Coral Gables 4 hours a day. Simpson would work there until 1965, aged 72. He would pass away 8 years later. Mike Goodman, meanwhile, would coach in the amateur Florida Hockey League, which would spring up after the Coliseum was converted back to an ice rink. Goodman would also serve as the rink manager for a time. He would also work part-time as a delivery driver for a laundry service for almost 40 years up until 1984, well into his 80s. Mike Goodman would die in 1991, aged 93. Goodman was the last member of the Winnipeg Falcons to leave this plane, and it is said that he carried his gold medal with him in his pocket every day. And that's the story of the Tropical Hockey League, a league that may have faltered in its existence, but one whose very existence betrays the notion that any market should be exempt from hockey. There's still a lot of parochialism in hockey circles about proper hockey towns. The truth is, no town can be a hockey town unless there's a culture for the sport, and while the Tropical Hockey League was probably a little too ahead of its time and hamstrung during its inception, over 80 years on, Florida has the potential to be a hockey hotbed. And not just because of the Panthers and the Lightning, not even because of the incompetent promoters who created the Tropical Hockey League, but because of people like Bullet Joe Simpson, Mike Goodman, and Art Coulter, who helped create a culture for hockey and skating in Miami. I just want to say a big thank you for making it this far. I can only assume you enjoyed this trip back in time to hockey in the tropics, that or you're a masochist nearly 40 minutes in. Researching the Tropical Hockey League was a time-consuming endeavour, and I was still unearthing more during the edit, so I can only apologise for all the notes regarding the later iterations of the league, as I learned quite a bit more from newspaper archives from after recording the narration. I want to credit a couple of resources that were instrumental in the creation of this video so I don't get H-Bomber Guide. The first is the wonderful Puckstruck blog by Stephen Smith. It's a superb repository of stories from the forgotten eras of hockey. Smith is a wonderful storyteller, and I recommend the book that accompanies his blog, Puckstruck. I also need to thank Christopher Knowlton and his book Bubble in the Sun, the Florida boom of the 1920s, and how it brought on the Great Depression. Maybe my chapter on the land boom seemed excessive for a league more than 15 years removed, but I wanted to set the scene and the conditions with which an ice hockey league popped up in Florida in the 1930s, and I knew exactly nothing about the Floridian land boom prior to scripting this video. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. I can't promise frequent uploads. I work in the Merchant Navy and I'm currently in the process of moving abroad. But these videos are a huge time sink, and while I do it just as a hobby, getting feedback and those endorphin releasing likes really helps motivate me. While the Venn diagram of vintage hockey and obscure football may be quite small, if you enjoyed this video, feel free to check out my video about San Marino and the many minnows of world football. As I mentioned in my previous video, I'm currently working on a script regarding British hockey and the impact the lack of NHL interaction with mid-tier nations is having on the game in the UK. That script is in a redraft state, and I'm going to wait until after the Worlds to begin recording. I also have plans to do a few shorter videos about contemporary hockey and maybe do some short super cuts of my videos to try and increase engagement. But of course, yesterday I was emailed by work and it looks like I might be going back early, so everything may end up on the back burner. Still, I have planned to release some stuff before the start of the next AHL season, so I'll be plugging away. If I no longer have a studio, I'm not quite sure where I'm going to be. Anyway, I'm waffling. If you made it this far, and you have my eternal thanks, and as always, thanks for enjoying my voice for this long.